Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon.
Hello. In this conversation with my son, Dave Jr., we start with a discussion of a model called Community of Practice that emerged when he was back in graduate school and doing some consulting for the Institute for Research and Learning. And here we are many years later. So what we did was we looked at whether it's helpful to have such a model to better understand the nature of practice and conversation. And I think you'll find in listening to this, the answer is, yeah, it seems that's so. We could do almost any other model that's out there, also called theory, and put it in adjacent position to our consideration of practice. And we see more about what practice does when it's being done by individuals and in a community of practice, the difference that can be made. So here is the old team back in action, Dave and Dad. Well, after a bit of a hiatus the last couple of months while I was putting a lot of time into finishing the book that Peter Bale started and I finished, I haven't done much podcast recording. So I'm eager to get us back into it. Between the last time I recorded one and now, Dave and I did a session for a global conference called Evolve 2021, where we took just a few minutes of one of the video versions of our recording, and we broke it down and looked at it with some points of reference that Dave taught about how social inaction works when you're watching it. So that was kind of fun, and we'll make sure it's up on our webpage. The session was recorded. But let's talk now about living this experience of being in practice. Just before we started, Dave mentioned something quite interesting about being interviewed in relation to his practice at Johns Hopkins University. So tell me a little bit about it, Dave.
Well, I thought it might be fun to talk about the concept of communities of practice. And I'll say up front that I haven't given it any thought right up to this very moment, apart from when it was came up as you would know better than I would say it was a popular, had its popularity, maybe as much as 20 years ago or more?
Yeah, around 20 years ago. Yeah. There was a sort of a very interesting movement of people who focus a lot on natural settings for learning as contrasted with school settings for learning, and put out the prospect that there's a whole heck of a lot more learning going on than meets the eye. And one of the ways that they saw that learning was manifest by people was something that they entitled communities of practice. So yeah, it is an old idea, but not an old phenomenon. I suspect you're going to tell me that it's still going on once you know what to call it.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I thought maybe we would just explore that, and you also being more attuned to the literature. Would you say that it's as a term that is A, still used, and B, still keeps some coherence, or has it kind of become watered down in general? Because I say the latter because when I Googled, my extent of research was Googling the term. I'll do it again right now. Communities of practice. And one comes up with the page, everything you need to know about communities of practice. And which is usually a sign where you're being given a very limited, watered down background. But it looked like a fairly vague definition. Now I can't find that one I found before, but here's one just looking at the Google page. Communities of practice are formed by people engaged in a process of collective learning in a shared domain of human endeavor. A way of locating language, organized groups of people have common interests in a specific technical or business domain. Now, that's pretty broad. I guess they get into a little more detail, but it seems like it's kind of broadened out. And I was thinking, since this is a podcast on practice, it's a term that has practice in it in the organization and business field. So it might be interesting just to kind of riff on what might be a good definition. And I've had a little bit of history in past work with groups that back in the late 90s were doing consulting work around communities of practice. And then I've thought about what now that I'm actually working in an organization, what kind of, am I part of communities of practice?
That's a good question.
Yeah. So I guess one way we could start is to look at the definition that you sent, which you thought was good. Mm-hmm. Do you want to give some background on what you sent me?
Well, I don't have it in front of me, but here's my thought on it. It was a bit of a trip down memory lane when you sent me a note this morning that we might want to talk about it. And one of my thoughts about it is that almost every era of managerial leadership, organization development, organization behavior, the human study that we've done in academic has certain nicely titled and easily defined phenomenon that are written that way, not for fellow academics or researchers so much as to give people some common ground to discuss something like community of practice. Mm-hmm. And since that was more of a consulting oriented group that you were part of, they wanted to find a way to get into an organizational setting and look for these more natural organizational practices about practice, actually. So I think they chose the word practice, which I was happy with looking back now, because that has everything to do with doing. And when people are striving to do better, whatever they intend to do that way, they tend to look for other people who can advise, can help, can model. And so it always has to start with one or two people. They start looking for people who do similar things. That's that fancy word domain. It does tend to be not people from all different walks of life and different interests. That's another way of getting together in a natural sort of like a community. But this one helped people find almost before Google, certainly before Google, find through almost a word of mouth where other people were who were doing interesting things like what they were doing. So you had communities of practice growing organically. Back in my experience, today we tend to call them networks, alliances. But one of the key things that perhaps we could talk about is that they are voluntary. As soon as they reach a level where they need a formal structure and they need appointed leaders and so forth, it becomes an organization, like the Organizational Behavior Teaching Society. It's no longer
right
a voluntary thing, and when it moves to that level, it becomes more difficult, ironically, for people to share things, because it becomes, this is how you should share, and so the sort of the energy and fun of discovering more people around, initially where you could reach them locally, but eventually nowadays globally, the fun of that, the spontaneity of that, requires conversation.
Yeah. So it reminds me of the literature on institutionalization, which is a theory of in organization sciences, so kind of a sociology, probably from sociology more as much as any other field. And it talks about, I couldn't tell you who the main writers are, but they talk about the process of going from these groups and even historically the apprentice systems, but then into the societies and into the academic societies, into the guilds or professional societies. And that professionalization becomes, that movement from, sounds like that movement from community of practice to professionalism, which can still have community of practice aspects of them. But in the meantime, you're also maybe dealing with the professionalized and sometimes regulated parts of it, like like professional therapists or even professional nutritionists. You'd have to be certified in a certain way. But I'd like to talk about one community of practice around nutrition that my wife and I are kind of participants in a certain way, as one of the examples that we might get into tonight. But so first, let me see. I sent you the link if you want to see it. But so what you had sent around was a definition from Etienne and Beverly Wenger Trainer from 2015, Introduction to Communities of Practice. This looks like a
web page.
Just a web page rather than a particular article. But here's the definition. What are communities of practice? Communities of practice are formed by people who engage in a process of collective learning in a shared domain of human endeavor, a tribe learning to survive, a band of artists seeking new forms of expression, a group of engineers working on similar problems, a clique of pupils defining their identity in the school, a network of surgeons exploring novel techniques, gathering of first-time managers helping each other cope. In a nutshell, communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. So that sounds like a I don't know if that's the field of defining definition, but it's an interesting one. This was from 2015. Yeah,
and it's interesting in regard to our looking at the nature of practice and particularly the nature of conversation. As practices grow, you need other people, and the way this reads is that once you find some affinity, you're attracted and essentially seeking a bond, which is at the very much eye level, of association. So the folks have formed these groups through the need to really know each other. These days, you can click and ask someone to be a friend on Facebook or on LinkedIn and claim that you know 2,000 people.
Yeah.
That's not what this is.
Right.
But the other piece of it is community. And to me, that's where the volunteerism really spikes up, that people create a positive interdependency that and for what purpose? So that they can be better at what they value doing the most. So that's a good connection.
Yeah. So and again, it's hard to know whether if I had done any proper research, I might have found a statement from around late 90s when it came up. But in the late 90s, I was kind of involved in it in part because I got a job contract for about 2 years, in 1998 with a consulting firm called Institute for Research on Learning, which was a company that spun off of Xerox PARC Some years before. It's probably about 4 or 5 years in when I joined, and built around I think communities of practice was prominent in their mission statement and in their primary kind of pitch to funders. I think a lot of their work, the majority of it, when I was there, was in education research and kind of classroom. And then I got in on a project that was doing some workplace consulting. We did part of a pretty big 2-year contract with a major insurance company. And this was looking at looking throughout their regions, but a couple of regions around the country, their headquarters, but also Southern California. So, and there, at that time, the focus was really on consulting using workplace ethnography, which was embedded observation, but also more the traditional qualitative social science methods, such as interviews, but using a lot of video. And I would say that for that particular group, communities of practice didn't really come up as a theme very much. I think possibly because it was more about what is workplace culture and what is workplace learning, because we were following like new agents who were apprenticed to existing insurance agents, and we kind of followed them around, and also we followed a rather charismatic woman training, doing trainings of new agents at their Southern California headquarters. So it was more of a standard workplace approach, but I think it had that learning concept, and it was trying to use ethnography to understand learning.
That was a great opportunity for you to see it in the flesh. And to interject just a moment, while that particular regional system was quite well organized and well established in all the conventional ways that you would look at it, when they started to look for learning, they still tended to think of it, I'm assuming, as more of a training, creating more, tools for learning. But what I'm thinking is that because you were really just watching people and taking notes and thinking about it, you really were also seeing the emergence of maybe micro communities of practice within that region, where people just needed to, if they were stuck or if they were excited about something that was going on, they would form mainly through conversations, enabled conversations. They would start forming these sort of not ad hoc systems, but eventually regularized systems where they knew that they could count on each other.
Yeah, I think that was happening through the training system that they had, which was this was one of the older big insurance companies, and they had with a good agent model. And traditionally, each agent would kind of do their own recruiting of their locals, but it was moving more towards centralized recruiting of new agents, but still the pairing with seasoned agents and the mentoring and the continuation of, and we can see the communities of practice within agents, within regions. They seem to have some good local communities and spontaneous groups and people who got to know each other. And then the mentoring process created more networks and localized community practices. And it was an interesting time for that particular company. It was right near the one of the crashes around 98. And interestingly, I think our group of consultants ended up having a difficulty on what to report to to their contractors,
to your funders. Yeah,
it's because it's one of those times where I think it was at the brief birth of ethnographic workplace studies as a consulting, and this quick death as soon as the markets crashed.
Yeah,
and consultants no longer had the patience for mostly academic researchers saying what's interesting about the sociological phenomena, when they really want to say, okay, give me a community practice that will increase our profits by 22%.
Give me a framework, give me seven rules.
I heard about this community of practice. I want one.
I want one, yeah.
And what will be the profit, and how class to turn around before we get one?
Yeah, exactly. And so, sadly, in a way, as they could have just like held back a bit, waited, be more patient. And a lot of these ways that people were conversing and helping each other and really pushing from the ground up innovative ideas about anything that mattered to the brass. Mm-hmm. But, and I've been watching these things for many years and through that time and beyond. And I've often seen something that had a nice possibility to create real innovation from the floor up was grabbed and put into a vice.
Yeah. And then this particular company got into banking essentially with all their assets, and that entire culture, I believe, crashed.
It did.
And now it's I haven't really looked into it, but I believe they have an entirely different way of doing things, and so those communities probably fell apart. Yeah.
So I'm not picking on the brass, but I am saying that what's so important, and to you and me, in this notion looking at practice, is that practice is human born. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the year of COVID, that may be a little crude to say, but each person brings the potential to create a practice commitment of their own personal resources to a kind of work, like mm-hmm. you mentioned, like your work, and that's pretty delicate. Mm-hmm. So if you're feeling the love of having nice, easygoing, helping each other out kind of climate, and discovering people who have cool ideas and saying, hey, can we talk about that? Can I borrow that idea? All of that is growthful and very much in line with the kind of learning that Peter and I focused on in our conversations. So where we are now is we never needed that more mm-hmm. because people have been broken away from, being in the same room kind of life's work style. Yeah. And a lot of things are happening, which is very evident. But mm-hmm. I'm curious, because when you told me that you thought this would be an interesting aspect to look at, you said that someone actually reached out to you, and in the course of having a conversation with you said, what about the community of practice?
Yeah, because this was a student who's working on her, I think it's her master's degree in library science at Florida State University. Her name is, I'm going to mess up her name, is Nayoon Han, because I'll probably send her the link give her credit for thinking of the field that I kind of fell into, which is research, particular research support done by academic libraries and around research data in particular. And that not only this was, I got in right at the beginning of a very emerging field, but it was mm-hmm. certainly a field where there was an emerging community of practice, mm-hmm. Which I could talk about in general, how it's built up over the last 10 years, but over the last few years, my library's been part of something called the Data Curation Network, which is a slightly more formalized community of practice, but we could think about whether it kind of fits the community of practice model, which was what this student was thought as well, and was, as part of the interview that we had. So the quick background, after my wife and I finished our degrees in sociology and didn't want to be professors and wandered aimlessly in expensive Southern California, not realizing that we had no future there.
Is that when I kept clutching my heart over the phone and saying, what?
Yeah, my wife had the brilliant idea to go back and get library degrees. Because a couple of reasons I won't go into, but in a way, the libraries, once we got into it, the academic libraries were a very interesting place for PhDs with aimlessly wandering PhDs.
Yeah, but who have a lot of curiosity.
Who want to keep that attachment to the academics and the academic lifestyle without being a professor or and not quite, being able to be researchers or other ways of staying in the field. So, so when I got in, I was interested in kind of I had a background as a database developer and had done that as the prior job before we went back to school. And I was looking more broadly at other aspects of kind of digital library support. But then when I got in at UCLA MLIS program, one of the professors was Christine Borgman. Was her field of study was looking at research data management and support for libraries, and she had funding for some interesting research. And since I had a research background, she snatched me up and helped fund that degree on research assistants jobs, which was nice. So, but it also prepared me for my current job. So, and right around that time, the federal funders, National Science Foundation and others, had a new requirement for data management plans as part of grant proposals, and also data sharing, which meant that researchers would need to share their data online publicly. So publicly funded data should be shared publicly as much as possible, and done the best way to do it online through online databases or data repositories. And so right around the time I was done with my degree, libraries were starting to develop this area of research support and it fit libraries fairly well because it didn't really fall into any one department or particular school. And for Johns Hopkins, which has a culture of a number of schools, which are in some ways their own islands, especially School of Medicine, but also the arts and sciences and engineering, but all of them very, very heavily grant dependent.
Therefore, data.
Yeah. So the compliance, it really means you have to start spinning up organizations to support new rules. The libraries were able to step in. So I got in at basically this new area of research support for libraries, doing consulting on how to plan for data management and data sharing in particular. And then we also operated an online data repository for publishing data online. And it's kind of expanded from there. But, at the same time, so this is obviously a major research university, and many of the other larger research universities started up similar roles for quite a while. And in the library world, academic libraries usually do things on scraps. So for many, even large universities, it'd be one librarian doing, in addition to other duties, doing this thing. So ours was one of the biggest, where we actually got funding for 3 people fairly early in. And now I have 3.5 and kind of merged it with other similar roles of data support. So where the communities of practice though come in is, how do you actually do this? How do you actually help people plan for data management planning? How do you help people archive? It's different than other digital, there's a field of how do you digitize documents and put them online. This is different. This is research data. Yeah. And we're taking in data from literally all the sciences and medicine. Yeah. So we kind of have to, and to some extent it's just files, but on another level, it's good to know a little bit about what it is that's coming in. So even how to open a file, something from astronomy, it's like, what is this? It's a dot. what are these formats? It's
1,000 tetrabits or whatever they are.
And different formats and different programs needed to open them. And so if you actually want to do what's called data curation, where you're not just taking a file and putting it online like a YouTube video, you are helping them document it so that other people can use that information. Right. Even slightly people outside their field potentially. And that takes an interaction with the researchers and knowing something about the research. So, so over time, there was a community of kind of informal communities of librarians with people with similar roles like myself, meeting at the different conferences.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And kind of sharing ideas. And then online, it's easier to kind of share resources. But and then some more specialized conferences would come up over time. Like one in the U.S. was, now I'm going to get the name wrong. It's not Research Data Alliance, but something called RDAP, where it was more focused. It's kind of a librarian-run conference, which is emerging slowly into not a professional organization, but a somewhat more professionalized conference that then starts to merge into more of the professional librarian associations. They start looking at, do you want to merge? Or, it's conference discussions about staying independent versus merging with larger ones. And so there's, mostly, and there's a few academic journals that kind of focus on that. So but it's still, I would say, as a field, one that is community of practice of practitioners. Not at the point where it's professionalized. Not the point where it's its own society, beyond being branches of conferences. And, you can, find interest groups within some of the larger library associations.
Well, that is in a very interesting way, a microcosm of why every community practice of any sort ever happened in the first place. And I think my conjecture is that before people knew what to do pretty well, they can do it pretty much within their own orbit. But as soon as the environment threw in a new opportunity or a new restriction in a way through regulation, but B, as all of the engineered sciences move out, as now has happened with technology and data in particular, almost everyone is rendered a beginner. This is one of Peter's great thoughts, that because change now puts us in a position that no matter what our credentials said and our our title and all the rest, suddenly we don't know enough to meet the demand as practitioners. And here's the key: you guys had to do it. It wasn't that you were going to take some notes and sit down in a classroom and teach about it, even though you've done a lot of training. You have to do it. And see, so that raises the stakes in the sense on how am I going to be successful unless I can get some other people to figure it out. And through proper conversation activity, we're not going to get into a position where we're competing. Well, if I tell you that, you're going to steal it and take it somewhere. It's very
which the library world is very good at. It's not. There's very few things that are competitive or need to be proprietary, because it isn't. They say of some of these things, they're of no value because you're not going to sell them very easily.
Yeah.
So it's information that might as well be shared.
In fact, that is the ethos of libraries from, the first centuries, that they were open. It is, we're here to collect things that we can get people to use. And so you were in the right environment. And frankly, given your scenario roughly 10 or so years ago when you were at UCLA, you were on the ground floor, and your professor was giving talks and being asked quite a bit, as I recall, about this new idea of curating data. Mm-hmm. And you were right there. So hooray.
So 10 years later, I still have a job. So that's nice.
You do. And it's a job where you're still learning as you're adding. And here's someone from down in Florida finding your name and reaching out and wanting to gain a bit of insight into your expertise. What will that do for her? It will maybe bring her closer into this part of library work, library in action, and you've helped her, and then she could say, "Hey, I met this really on the phone. I interviewed this really cool guy."
It wasn't just about me. She's looking into this new thing. I'll say briefly, which is also, I would say, another community of practice that developed out of these people meeting regularly at conferences.
There you go.
They thought up of a new way to share, to basically write for a grant to start an organization around sharing this data curation knowledge, this specialization, where we have people who get into this field even without any library degrees, or have PhDs in different sciences, have different backgrounds. So the idea was to have a network amongst, the initial grant participants, which is about, I think 6 schools, mostly the major universities in this part, and that's grown a little bit. It's called the Data Curation Network. It can be looked up at datacuration.network.org. And they got a grant from Sloan Institute, and then another from ILMLS, which is a specific library funder, who did a kind of an education side of things. I was involved in both. So basically the idea is a network of librarians who will take data sets from other schools within the networks, where the people working there don't know really how to curate it. They don't have the background in that field of science. They don't know those file formats. So other people in the network have that skill. So I have a lot of background in human subject data and privacy. So I'll get those data sets to kind of screen for risk. And we would send some in other fields to different schools. And so it became, that was set up as a community of practice around not just sharing expertise, but then through this education grant, we did trainings in data curation, general data curation around a particular model, and also had participants in these trainings develop what they call primers on different topics, like different formats, and make them public documents for how to curate data that comes from astronomy or uses programs, some engineering programs like MATLAB or human subjects data. And so using the communities of practice to develop some learning resources. So I think it really captures a lot of that definition.
It does. And I want to throw one more layer into this as I was listening to when they were developing the manuals, when they're developing the models and so forth. The people who are doing the practice, they're doing it to help other people get it faster than if they, just threw something at the wall. So my point is that this is, in my mind, an awful lot of what eventually becomes theory arises from a community of practice. It's not some great mind sitting up on high who can visualize all of this and then have it turned into some kind of instruction. It's coming from the ground up.
Yeah,
because it is, and because you are professionals, it has credence. And now someday, and maybe it's already happened, I know Professor Borgman was picking up on that and then writing it up in such a way that it then met the attention of people studying library science. So,
right.
But that is emergent. And yeah. I would suspect if someone could devote a lifetime, Dave, to finding these experiences that you've gone through where something just came off the ground around the time that you were available. And you could probably find that in so many ways that eventually are claimed to be, theory.
Right. Oh, yeah. But really we're looking at practice.
But then you could then, if something arises that sounds like that, putting the additional research work into it, the scholarly work into any one of these models,
sure,
which you've been doing in order to create the training that you're doing particularly for graduate students and professors, that it's got a lot of thought in it. And eventually it could meet the test of being something that's formally recognized as David Fearon's theory of.
Well, it wouldn't be mine. It would be.
I know it wouldn't be.
It'd be this group's.
That's where the whole thing falls apart because you get all these people doing these neat things with support, external support. But as soon as one person kind of pops up and says, "Hey, I want to be the king of this," it's the voluntary spirit sometimes gets drained off.
Well, luckily we're all too busy, and there's no way to make it a full-time job very easily now. Because one organizational thing that's now needing to happen is the grant funding's done, and so they've now transitioned into what makes it sustainable. So this next year will be the first year of a membership model where we set up fees for the participating members, but it needs to be kind of worked out of how much of our actual time are we putting out versus getting in, and we can start counting beans and it becomes a rather fragile system potentially.
It does. Yeah.
But then there's still an attitude, well, whatever kind of keeps the network going, because it's kind of fun to still know people in the network and have our all hands meetings and so keeping the community going, but still needing to kind of have it pay for itself.
That's now the classic problem when Peter Vail, Alan Cohen, David Bradford, and John Miller, and some others who were professors very early in their careers, and one of the first group that was actually teaching something called organization behavior, they found that they needed some mutual support. So they created something which they called a society, Organization Behavior Teaching Society, but having its 50th anniversary next year. So I've been one way or another involved in that for my whole career. But and I've been on the board a couple of times, and it always gets to that point where you start looking at how much personal time you're volunteering for these leadership positions and hosting programs like you've done versus what your institution is gaining from it beyond even what you're gaining from it. It's pretty, you've been on those conferences with us, you and Linda, and that it's enjoyable and expansive and you've really formed friendships that you can now, like I've had a number of those people in the podcast. Yeah. So it really is a very important aspect of people trying to understand themselves as practitioners to recognize that even though the term community of practice was sketched out over 25 years ago to get people to understand something is different here, it's still at work, and we could name it anything we want. But if you did not have this, Dave, when you were breaking into this field too, an emergent field, and let me ask you, how would it feel if you really couldn't find anyone at any other university who was doing the work? You were there. You had to do the work. That was your job.
Yeah. Had other schools not done this, had there not been like maybe the funding mandate, which would have fizzled which could certainly have happened with some administration comes in and there's no longer a data sharing mandate. And it did kind of slacken in a way, and we had to figure out more things to do, more trainings and more areas of support, which is a good thing. So,
yes, it is.
So it's interesting, but I think now that these communities, it's now an established part of the library world. It's gonna keep going. And it's and another thing I was thinking of as you were talking is that with these societies, you get academic credit as a faculty member. It's part a little bit called service, a little bit of service, a little bit of credit for doing presentations, not as much as publications.
Right.
Now, the library world, you have some schools that have faculty librarians, and schools like ours that don't. So we don't have service credit. And if I take the time, which I never have, to write an article, I don't get any particular credit for that, except for, maybe my annual review, I get to say I've done something. But other participants may actually be getting more credit for being more involved. So it's interesting balance there in the library world as far as the different structures that can be done that you don't always get with just faculty led societies.
So that brings up the whole range of questions about rewards for to the degree of which you can participate in these evolving communities of practice. It's almost always that little core group, like I mentioned, who get things started, had some institutional support to do it. And maybe they met at a restaurant once to kick out around the idea, but then as they were going to become more formally involved, they had some trade-offs.
Yeah,
but they also had
to have the grant to get it going, or else it wouldn't have happened.
There was something like that. Yeah. But I think we got to watch the time. But I think what's happens though is that as long as individuals and groups of individuals find real satisfaction in gaining this identity as being the first to know in a particular arena, and you are still in the first to know category. And the other piece is first to know something that's going to have a very long future, because all the things that have changed. You used to write databases with a piece of off the shelf software, remember, for a huge astronomy undertaking, all these big telescopes. Now that wasn't that long ago, but that was close to state of the art, and you were doing that for a major university. And so here we are today, and what I mean by the long future is that many things within the library world, like books, for example, that have covers and they have to be put on shelves, are going away and being replaced digitally. So you're moving into the digital world with a real clear purpose, but also a lot of stimulation.
Right. Yeah. And it's, so it is an interesting for libraries in themselves having to change within the academic world.
Yeah.
This certainly was an example of that. Well, I'll leave for the audience one more example of a community of practice that I would invite listeners to look into on their own. If this being near just ahead of New Year's, it'll probably be released afterwards. But if you're thinking about New Year's resolutions and the diet, you may find interesting and ask yourself, is this a community of practice around the whole food, plant-based diets? And this is something my wife and I have been struggling to keep up with for years and actually put into practice. Yeah. And it's one of the hardest things that can be done, because you'll realize if you've escaped being an alcoholic or a drug addict, where do you find out how much of a food addict you are when you need to give up? If you were trying to give up high fat, salt, oil, and sugars, and most processed food, and eat whole foods and plants and no meat and no dairy,
That's a change, man.
That's a change.
And there's a tremendous emphasis on out there in the world trying to make you buy the next.
Everything in the world, as soon as you step out the door, turn on the TV, is telling you this is wrong. But the nutritional science is more and more showing that this is the way to live a healthy life.
Yeah.
But the interesting part, just to leave on community of practice, is it is a community practice where online is, I think, really helped. Because if you did get into it, the couple of key names are Dr. McDougall, Dr. Doug Lyle, Chef AJ. If you go to YouTube, Chef AJ, just Chef and an AJ, you'll see her YouTube channel, and you'll quickly get into a massive community of practice around this type of lifestyle, really, and increasingly it's kind of I think it's starting to hone in around what is a food addiction, especially as under COVID, like my wife and I, we gained our COVID-19 pounds and just went nuts eating out, even though it's that's somehow,
even though you're risking your life to be out there,
apparently, but that didn't stop us. And I think we talked to a health coach who has lots of clients who for years did wonderfully, and then these last 2 years just lost it
and burn,
went into their bad food binges. Like
so
that.
I see the need for mutual reinforcement and support, and the need there's a tremendous amount of dialogue around what
and it's learning, a massive learning,
huge, and who do you listen to and who's a quack and all that has to be sorted out.
So it's just an interesting one. So anyone who's interested in improving their diet just a little bit may run into this new community and hopefully at least lose a little weight.
Take part and discover, because each person who is trying to overcome that has to figure out some life changes, some ways, and that they can turn into ideas that they can share. So I think that's a great closing point, Dave, because there's no one in listening who is going to stop listening now and not eat for the next 20 hours. That's right. They're going to eat something and they're going to remember something that we've all experienced through this phase of COVID, which is, we're home a lot and there's this refrigerator. Right. Or we're excited to get out now because we can get into some places. And so, the work that Peter kind of drew me into first 50 years ago, but lately when, we were collaborating to try to get the book done, and we need the podcast to give a chance for Peter to use his thought out loud because he could no longer sit at his keyboard very long. The point is that he came up with something very early in his manuscript called the Big P. Practice not just librarians who are data conservatives, but the Big P is everyone, one way or another, can choose to become more committed. This is, I think, the right word to change initially for themselves, and then find a group of people who can reinforce and support that, and then together, life can be better before you leave the world. And so we're right at the point where not only do people have to eat, but they also have to figure out ways to make really good use of their lives. And get healthier, since the world has now changed, focused on one particular disease, and yet heart disease is killing many more people than COVID. Oh, so, don't mention that to an old man like me, but you're right. But anyway, this has been fun, and thank you again. And once I learned the last few steps of how to do my own podcast production all the way through, this will be featured. So thanks a lot.
If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Podomatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to enactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to enactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.